I'm here to introduce Kent. Kent Weare is a senior manager of enterprise architecture and integration at Interpipeline. And I'm sure you know, prior to this, he was working with Microsoft as the principal program manager on the Microsoft Flow team, where he focused on analytics, governance, security, and administration experiences. He is passionate about learning disruptive technology, and he shares his learnings as an emerging technology and cloud editor at infoq.com. And you must have already seen him on the Middleware Friday, where he vlogs about recent integration changes and challenges and solutions. In this session, Kent will discuss how his integration practice includes both Azure Logic Apps and Microsoft Flow. You will also learn how Interpipeline has learned to choose the right tool for the job and found that there is room for both services within the enterprise. So over to you, Kent.
All right, thank you very much. So as you can see, the title of this talk is around Azure Logic Apps and Microsoft Flow and why you should use both of them. And so where this is coming from is in part due to some frustration on my part, where I go to these Microsoft events, and I can now freely say this, and I feel like there's not a lot of prescriptive guidance on what is the right tool to be used. Naturally, there's going to be some preferences depending upon who you talk to. And so what I wanted to focus on with this talk is to give you some real examples and some prescriptive guidance on how we at Interpipeline have gone about choosing what is the right tool for the job. So here you can see a little bit about me if you're not familiar. I feel like I'm in a pretty good position to provide this talk, knowing that I do have a rich background in enterprise integration going back to BizTalk 2004. I believe I started blogging about Logic Apps in 2015. If you remember EDI, EAI Labs, even earlier. And certainly I've presented at this conference about Logic Apps myself. Now more recently, I am a Microsoft Flow MVP now, still active in the Logic Apps community as well. And previously I was a PM on the Flow team. So I feel like I've got a pretty good sense of these different tools and what are the strengths and what are the opportunities with both of them. And so something that we're going to talk a little about today is outcomes. And that's really where I want you to focus is don't worry so much about the individual features, but think about how you can drive an outcome. And I think if you start thinking with that in mind, the tool is less of a concern. And you should be more focused about what is the value that you bring to your organization. So as mentioned, I do work for Interpipeline. So we are an energy, transportation, and storage company. We're headquartered in Canada, and we also have some storage facilities in Europe. So the UK, Sweden, Denmark, and the Netherlands. So we're going to talk a little bit about the tale of the tape. Yes, I'm a sucker for Rocky movies. I watched Creed 2 on the way over on the plane. And so let's just have a brief introduction of both tools. Now, we've seen some of this in previous presentations, so I'm going to move through this section rather quickly. But Microsoft Flow, it's an integration software as a service, which means you do not need an Azure subscription in order to use it. The product group resides inside of the Dynamics organization. So if you're starting to see more and more deep integrations with Dynamics and Power Apps, that would probably be one of the reasons. License entitlements generally occur through Office 365 or D365. In addition, there are some standalone licenses that you can purchase that we talked a little bit about yesterday. And it is one of the components of the overall Power Platform. So here's a screenshot of the Flow Maker portal. So you can access this at flow.microsoft.com. And within this experience, you're going to see a personal view, which is My Flows. If you share a flow with someone else or someone else shares a flow with you, that flow will show up in your team flows. And then there's also the business process flows, which Sarah demonstrated yesterday afternoon. Microsoft Flow does have templates similar to Logic Apps. And the purpose of these is to have some blueprints or some starter examples that you can use and build on top of. So who builds or who provides these templates? So the community. You have the opportunity to take a pattern that you've used with success, submit it to the product group. They'll actually go ahead and review it. And if it makes sense and it's not a duplicate, they'll include it for others to use as well. Microsoft naturally provides templates themselves. whether it's the Flow product group or it could be a partner product group like, say, SharePoint or Dynamics. And then naturally, if you have third-party connectors, those vendors will also provide templates so that people can get started with their technology as well. Now, from a connectors perspective, I believe this was the number that was in Kevin's slide yesterday, but there are around 275 different connectors that exist. Obviously, there's a rich first-party ecosystem that people can take advantage of. You have third-party connectors like DocuSign and Adobe Sign as well that you can leverage. And something that is a little bit different is that Flow does have some licensing considerations when you want to use custom connectors or premium connectors. So that's where you need to think a little bit differently about licensing and how you go about licensing your organization to use those connectors. You can also naturally connect to the cloud, but you can also use the on-premise data gateway in order to tap into some local or on-premise data sources. So a big part of the Microsoft Flow platform is approvals. So these are authenticated approvals, which means you can't just forward an approval to someone else and have them acknowledge that approval. It is authenticated. All of the data related to approvals is tracked in a database called CDS, the Common Data Service. More recently, there are custom approval options, so it's no longer just approve or reject. You can also create custom options as well, as not applicable, or I need more information as well. And then you can respond to these approvals through a variety of different mediums, whether it be mobile, email, the Flow Approval Center, or even Microsoft Teams. We showed a little bit about this yesterday, but Microsoft Flow supports buttons, both virtual and physical. And as part of that, you have this deep integration through templates or in-product experiences with tools like SharePoint, Dynamics 365, OneDrive for Business, or Microsoft Teams in order to kick off these flows. I also touched on the geolocation trigger, which is part of the Flow mobile app. That's a new investment as well. Now, from an ALM perspective, there's something called solutions, which Sarah demoed yesterday. This is how you can package up multiple flows, Power Apps, or other Dynamics components and actually move them from one environment to another environment as a single deployable unit. This was something that was launched back in October. There are some gaps, including custom connectors, the parameters, if you have, like, say, a SharePoint list that's different in test versus prod, connections, and then naturally, there's not currently an Azure DevOps integration experience. Governance, we touched on this a little bit yesterday, is very important with this platform. The idea is you've got a democratized set of tools. You may want to limit what users can do with the platform itself. So we have management connectors where you can automate governance. There's data loss prevention policies where you can basically create two buckets and put, say, business-related connectors in one bucket and non-business related connectors in another bucket, and then you can only communicate with connectors within that same bucket. There's admin analytics. All flow events, I shouldn't say all, but most flow events surface in the Office 365 Security and Compliance portal, where you can subscribe to using webhooks and apply governance from that perspective. And then another important, feature of Flow is that there's a 30-day run limit. So if you have a flow that's waiting on a response, say from an approval, at 30 days, basically that will turn into a pumpkin. Another feature of Flow, it's probably a feature of both, is you do have the ability to take a flow and graduate it to a Logic app. Now, naturally, if you're trying to use features that don't exist in Logic apps, this isn't going to work. So you can't move a flow that, say, has approvals or buttons or mobile notifications, because those are some of the few connectors that don't exist inside of Logic apps that are inside of Flow. So that's a very quick primer on Flow. Let's now talk a little bit about Logic apps. And once again, I'm going to move through this pretty quickly because you've seen a lot of this already. So Logic apps is an integration platform as a service. You do need an Azure subscription. And the product group resides inside of Azure as opposed to Dynamics like the Flow team. The earlier offering for Logic apps was all consumption-based billing. It obviously still exists. It's a multi-tenant configuration. But now there is dedicated capacity through ICE, and we're going to talk a little bit about that later. Now, also what Matt just shared with you is that Logic Apps is part of the overall Azure Integration Services offering, which includes API management, service bus, and event grid. Now, you'll see a similar number around connectors, over 275 available. I would say, and this is my personal opinion, I didn't do a one-to-one mapping, but I would say there's around 95% symmetry between the Flow connectors and the Logic App connectors. And I think some of the core differences from a Logic Apps perspective is some of those enterprise connectors. So when you talk about SAP, IBM MQ, AS2, Edifact, those are not connectors or actions that show up inside of the Flow portal or the Flow experience. Naturally, you've got Microsoft first-party connectors that are available in Logic Apps, third-party connectors, custom connectors. Now, one difference is that Logic Apps doesn't have this notion of standard versus premium connectors, in part because you're paying per action. So that's something that you don't have to be concerned with inside of Logic Apps. So what this means is if you were trying to use Flow with, say, Salesforce, Salesforce is considered a premium connector, you would need to have a P1 license inside of Flow to use that. Inside of Logic Apps, using Salesforce is the same as calling SharePoint. There's no additional license or consumption required. A big part of Logic Apps now is the VNet support through ICE. So this allows you to actually connect to your on-premise data assets through the ICE and through your VNet, which basically takes your cloud instance and treats it as an extension of your own data center. So when you actually go ahead and say want to use, say, HTTP, you're actually hitting your server. You're not actually going through the internet. Naturally, you can still use the on-premise data gateway as well, but if the ICE connector exists, then that's a great opportunity to make a direct connection into your on-premise environment. Derek touched a little bit on this morning, some of the different experiences for authoring a Logic app. So naturally, you have the web browser. You have Visual Studio 2017 and more recently 2019. Visual Code, Derek showed some of the recent investments in that area. And you do have continuous integration, continuous deployment as well using Logic Apps. So this is something that we've taken advantage of at Interpipeline in terms of how we build and deploy Logic Apps. In addition, and this is a key difference between both of the platforms, is the enterprise integration capabilities, which is, I'm sure why most of you are here. And this is by leveraging the integration account, you can actually take your typed schemas and perform flat file, encoding, decoding, have XML transformations, JSON transformations, and have trading partner agreements and partners. These are all scenarios that don't light up inside of Flow natively. Obviously, you can do a bunch of expressions and things of that nature, but I wouldn't recommend it. Next up is ICE, that VNet connectivity. So inside of Azure, you create a VNet for all of your Azure resources. You can then inject your Logic Apps deployment inside of that VNet. It provides you then private static IPs. You can have your own inbound domain names. You've got dedicated compute, isolated storage, but you still have scale out and scale in capabilities. So this was something that we tested. Naturally, we're paying a flat rate for our ICE instance, but if we do experience load, we want those same capabilities that exist in PaaS in order to provide that scale out. We can actually take advantage of that inside of ICE as well. So we do have a flat cost, which means it is predictable. It's something that we can budget for. And recently, the product team has provided some extended limits. So if you've ever experienced some of the throttling, the 429 that Derek talked about this morning, we're starting to see higher limits when you have ICE in order to avoid some of those different scenarios. You also have larger messages, and you do have support for increased request response timeouts, up to 4 minutes. Now, we at Interpipeline, we were an early adopter of ICE, so I want to thank Kevin for he was our go-to from a product perspective, and also Sham and his engineering team as well. As we were early adopters, we participated in the private preview, then we moved to the public preview, and we actually went live on ICE prior to it being GA. So certainly appreciate the support from the team. What were some of our drivers for moving to ICE? The big one was VNet connectivity. We do have SAP, and while the SAP support for VNet isn't quite there yet, we know it's coming, but we wanted to ensure we had a very stable connection into our data center, and that we didn't have some of the throughput constraints that exist in an on-premise data gateway. We also use a data virtualization platform called Denodo, which allows us to do data abstraction and take all of these different protocols like ODBC, JDBC, and expose those data sources as RESTful feeds. That is a system that lives on-prem. We wanted the ability to connect through that through the VNet as well. The increased thresholds and limits were important to us because it gives us a more predictable performance, and it still gives us PaaS-like management. So after being through BizTalk upgrades for 2004, 2006, 2009, 2013, 2016, that's not a business I'm interested in anymore. So now that's a problem or a challenge we give to Microsoft, and we focus on just providing the value to our business units. We've chatted a little bit about this before. Kind of like Flow has all of these built-in experiences with Dynamics and Office, you're going to see these built-in experiences with Azure and some of the other Azure services, including APIM, Service Bus, Functions, Event Grid, and BizTalk Server. Monitoring, and this is another key difference between the two platforms as well. We can take advantage of Azure monitoring in order to get like near real-time events and alerting. We can establish webhooks so that we have other services that can call Logic App and actually have some centralized monitoring and centralized ticket logging. In addition, we also have Serverless 360, which provides us these capabilities. From a Flow perspective, you don't have those abilities. You get some emails that'll tell you that a flow has failed. That'll get sent to the owner of the flow. It is not overly predictable. It's generally something you'll see at the end of the week. So this is for when we're shipping data back and forth and our business units are depending upon it being timely. This is an important consideration for us as well. Governance. Now, governance is very different between Logic Apps and Flow in the sense that by having access to the Azure portal, that is actually one way of governing who can actually create a Logic App. Versus Flow, anyone that has an Office 365 subscription can go ahead and actually create a flow. So there is no real need for DLP because you have restricted access through Azure already. In addition, you have the Azure Identity Access Management rules. So these are your RBAC rules where you can actually say, okay, I want you to have access to Azure, but I'm not going to give you the ability to own or create a Logic App, but you might have the ability to read and be an operator. Log Analytics is something that we use in order to take the telemetry that's running from our Logic Apps and then actually build reporting on top of it. So that's another feature that doesn't exist inside of Logic Apps, inside of Flow. We also have 90-day limits on Logic App execution with configurable history. And this is in the multi-tenant, as Kevin mentioned earlier, on ICE that has been expanded to 1 year. And then naturally, you also have security boundaries through resource groups. So if you don't have access to a resource group, you naturally can't go ahead and provision Logic Apps in that resource group. So if we talk a bit about the battle, and the battle often comes from the community itself as well. Naturally, we're all human. We all have preferences. We all have our professional persona, whether we come from a pro dev background or we're a power user. And I find that this oftentimes is a big influence in terms of what tool you should use. And I always find it interesting when I see some folks from the enterprise space where they may feel that Flow is perceived as a toy or just for personal productivity. And then I see the flip side. I see people that come from SharePoint backgrounds and dynamic backgrounds, and they want to use Flow for everything. So they'll be asking, like, why doesn't Flow have code behind? Why can't Flow communicate with an Azure function? And it's one of those things where it's like, why don't you just use Logic Apps? And so that's something that I always find interesting in terms of people and their preferences. And sometimes this comes down to licensing. With people in SharePoint, they're not used to paying for automation, right? SharePoint Workflow Designer was always included in your license. If you have to introduce Logic Apps, that could be a barrier of entry. Now you have to talk to a customer about licensing. So sometimes people will try to pull that lever, but once again, they're focusing about themselves, not necessarily what is the right tool for the job, what is the right tool for the business itself. So it doesn't have to be this big competitive competition, right? I truly believe that organizations can actually leverage both tools, and that's essentially what we're trying to do. And I think the big thing to focus on is what about the business, right? So far we've done this, checklist of feature, this feature, that feature, this feature, that feature. It doesn't really matter, right? When it comes to the business, they don't care if you're using Logic Apps. They don't care if you're using Flow, right? They're interested in an outcome. And I think that's the way we have to look at this, is what is the value that we're driving for our clients or for our business units. Now, I've seen Dan do this on stage before. I tried to find video. I couldn't actually find anything. But it's this whole idea that just because you can do something doesn't mean that it's the right thing to do, right? Use the right tool in order to achieve the outcome that you're after. So let's talk a little bit about myths right now. So myth number 1, only pro devs, experts can do automation/integration work, right? It's not the case. Obviously, there's complexity. There's going to be things that are more difficult that require certain skills. But this is a myth where it says, only I can do this. And to Matt's point, when you have some of that centralized integration company centers, sometimes that opinion emerges. And it's like, no, we do that. Only us. No one else can do it. So another myth is anyone can do this. And I think this is just as much of a fallacy, right? Where it's like, oh, that looks easy. I just have to click, 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 and next thing you know, I've got this integration, this automation going. And I always like to look at it as this, right? Like another satisfied citizen developer, where, they've been positioned as this is really simple, but wait a minute, there's some learning curve involved here. And so ultimately, I think it comes down to organizational design. And you should be selecting the right tools based upon the design of your organization and naturally the complexity. So what does that really mean? So I think part of it is the size and type of the organization. If you are in a smaller organization, naturally you have to wear more hats, right? So that might involve you choosing one tool over the other. If you're in a larger organization, you may have some silos that you have to deal with, or you might have some subsidiaries that you have to deal with as well. That'll also have an impact. Another thing that I hear that really rubs me the wrong way is that business users always want to do this. End users want to do all of this. But it's also, yes, there's some of them that do, but there's also some accountants who want to be accountants. There's some engineers that want to be engineers. And I think that's another important consideration. So yes, sometimes when you have a passionate end user who obviously has a lot of technical skills, they can learn these things. They can pick it up. But it doesn't mean that everyone wants to do that. Another thing to consider is, do you have a centralized or decentralized IT arrangement, right? Do you have a common intake for all work? Or is it more decentralized, where you might have work being done in the different business units versus a central IT team? Another thing that emerges is this cross-domain concerns. So a scenario we run with is we've got an SAP team. They're not really interested in doing a lot of integration. They're focused on SAP. We might have other groups that support SaaS applications like Workday, where they don't have that expertise as well. So if you're now starting to go to those teams and say, oh yeah, just go use Logic Apps or go use Flow, build that interface, they're kind of like, yeah, not interested. That's not what I was hired to do. I want to focus on my specific discipline. That's where you might need a team like a center of excellence to emerge and actually help support those interfaces. Complexity, I think, probably plays the largest role in terms of what tool to use. So I've sort of started from top to bottom, simple to complex. And these are some of the scenarios or use cases. And so you've got personal productivity, forms over data, process automation, pro-dev extensibility, like creating, say, custom connectors or functions, enterprise application integration, trading partner integration, and regulation and compliance. Now, what this doesn't mean that you can't use Logic Apps for some of those simpler use cases, but I feel if you were doing that, you're probably using your resources incorrectly, where there's actually a lot of what I would call low-hanging fruit that exists in this organizational scaling opportunity zone. And this is what we've actually been able to leverage by using the Power Platform in order to actually have greater outcomes by involving more people in building automation and integrations. Naturally, we still have a use case for Logic Apps. We do have some complexity, and we want our senior devs that are working on those harder problems. But the whole point is you don't want just your senior devs working on the hard problems, because it means that you're leaving other areas of opportunity untouched. And I think that's where the combination of both technologies actually allows you to scale. So with this scaling opportunity, I think the big thing is to understand what are the limitations of democratized technology. You do need to educate and empower these users. You need to implement governance to ensure you're not creating risk. And number one, you need to be able to drive business outcomes. Because once again, the business units don't care if you're using Logic Apps or Flow. So let's put this in practice. Let's talk about some real examples at Interpipeline in terms of how we've gone about addressing different use cases and choosing the appropriate tool. So the first one we're going to talk about is talent acquisition. So this is essentially for contractors. When someone wants to bring a contractor on board, they need to go through an approval process. This is currently a 2-level approval. It starts with the general manager and then goes up to an executive. VP, in this case, it's our CFO. Now, this was the previous process in November. It was a Word template. And you would go and you'd print off this Word template. Then you would go and get the GM signature. And naturally, you don't want to take those to her one by one. So they end up stacking up at her assistant's desk. And then they get signed. And then someone takes them from the 25th floor to the 32nd floor. And then they get dropped in the bin of the CFO. And obviously, he's a busy guy. He's not going to sign these off one by one. And so what this does is creates a whole bunch of lag. And in the meantime, there's processes that are dependent upon this approval. We need to actually create statements of work. We need to actually get signatures from the staffing agency. We need to actually onboard this person. So now we're introducing a bunch of lag. So this is what the process looks like right now. It's an electronic form. We've got mobile approvals through Flow. We're capturing all of the audit inside of SharePoint. Once the GM approves, it goes to the CFO. Once he approves, it's then captured in audit. And probably the biggest learning that we got out of this was, we initially targeted this based on how can we improve productivity around approvals, but what we missed was all of the data that we were collecting on the back end and actually building a Power BI dashboard that actually gives us insight in terms of our hiring patterns. So for example, if you have 52 forms to sign off before Christmas, before you go on your Christmas vacation, at probably approval 10, you're probably starting to slide in terms of like, what did I approve before? Why is this business analyst getting $10 more per hour than this one? Now it's all your mental memory or your muscle memory in terms of like trying to keep track of all that. Now with actually having analytics, we can actually go ahead and understand what is our average rate. We can see when are people starting, when are people expected to offboard. So now logistically, we can start to plan in terms of like how many desks do we need? When are these desks going to free up? How many licenses do we need from Office 365 to support them? So here's essentially an animated GIF of the solution itself. This is a very simple Microsoft form where we're going to collect information about the contractor, their title, their rate, the agency they're going through, who they report to, things of that nature. Then we'll go ahead and hit submit, and then here's our Microsoft Flow, where we're going to capture a few pieces of data inside of variables. We're going to kick off our approval. We're going to update SharePoint lists as we go through. And so we have all of that information tracked so that we can then layer on Power BI on top of it. Here's the approval itself, which is available on email or mobile. And one of the other benefits of having all of this information stored in SharePoint is we can actually generate form letters using the Microsoft Office or Microsoft Word connector, where we now have the ability to do a mail merge through Flow by having a button inside of SharePoint that can kick off a flow and pass along the record that's currently in context along with it. I'll just let it catch up here. So here it is here. That's a flow button as part of the ribbon. We've got a record selected, and then boom, we have this form. Previously, we would have to, because it was all handwritten, or typed out and then signed manually, we'd have to have our EA, our executive assistant, go ahead and type all of that back into this form letter, which introduced delays, opportunities for errors, etc. Another scenario that we implemented was around Power BI Pro license approvals. So Power BI Pro is around $10 per user per month, so it's not overly expensive. However, that number starts to add up rather quickly. So we want a little bit of oversight in terms of how we go about provisioning these licenses. So we went ahead and created an electronic form, had a Flow Mobile approval. We're capturing all of the audit once again inside of SharePoint. Then we can actually go ahead and provision the license. And we can do this in part due to Azure Active Directory and actually using AD groups as part of our licensing. So basically someone gets put into that AD group, they automatically get a license assigned to them. We keep the requester up to date with email, and then naturally we can log a help desk ticket so that from an audit perspective, everything is captured. So here's the flow that supports this workload. Now what's interesting about this is that this was a BI developer on our Power Platform team that built this workflow. This was the first flow that they've ever built. Never seen flow before. And it was something that they did over the course of a few hours. So if you think about outcomes, this is great. I could have had one of the Logic App developers go out and build this no problem. However, they were focused on some more complex work, and we actually brought someone in new to actually go ahead and build this. And so, once again, my boss didn't come to me and say, is that a Logic App or is that a flow? She said, oh, this is great. We've now automated this process. Because before, it was just the Wild West of emails going back and forth and someone manually assigning a license, right? So we've brought structure, automation, and productivity. So what are some of these characteristics of these flow solutions? So there was a lot of form inputs, right? Whether that form's in Microsoft Forms or if it's in Power Apps. Approvals are naturally a big part of the platform, and we see that occurring a lot. And these were well-defined or popular endpoints. We weren't building custom connectors. This was generally Office 365. SharePoint, email, forms, pretty straightforward, lots of information out there. And none of this was time sensitive either or confidential in nature. So let's move on to Logic Apps and some of the scenarios that we've built out for Logic Apps. So far we went live with Logic Apps back in April. So this is something we're continuing to add to it, but these are some of our production use cases. We started off with a lot of HCM or human capital management scenarios, generally involving SaaS applications. So we have a scenario around benefits enrollment. That was previously a manual process. When you joined the company, someone was logging into another website and typing all of your information in. We have a donations and sponsorship program where if as a company we go ahead and sponsor different nonprofit organizations, we're managing that through a SaaS process. We also have office and personnel logistics through another SaaS application. So a lot of this involves like Workday as sort of the source of truth, and then how we're integrating with other SaaS applications. We've also used it for external production reporting. So we have an arrangement with another party where we own a facility. They operate it for us. They have information in some of the operational systems that we need to integrate back in with our corporate systems around transportation. So this is another scenario where we've used Logic Apps. The last one is internal production exception reporting, and this one is in our final stages of QA. And this speaks to the agility, where we were basically making a change at a facility where we were going to be able to onboard new product into our pipelines. So there was a truck loading station that was being implemented. And it was something that was, last minute, hey, IT, we need you to go do this. And we need to integrate this data from a lower operational network into our corporate network. And we were able to do that with Logic Apps, over the course of a few hours with changing requirements and actually access another network. So not a scenario for Flow. It was a great scenario to address inside of Logic Apps. So what are some of these common characteristics across these solutions? We are using the integration account. We do have XML data mapping that we need to do. We've got flat files involved as well. We also have sensitive data. So Workday, we don't just allow anyone to connect to Workday to consume HR data. We actually have to do whitelisting across a specific account to do this. We have to sign NDAs with our HR department in terms of this data as well. These are not things you want to make available to everyone. Security, with keys. So we're using Key Vault to store some of these API secrets when we need to talk to some of these SaaS applications. We do have some custom connectors involved here. Once again, this is more of a specialized skill set. We're using nested logic apps in many cases where that's not something that's available in Flow. You can actually have a flow call another flow, but it's really a disconnected scenario. We are using the VNet. We are talking to that data virtualization platform. So having that direct access without worrying about gateways is a benefit for us. And we're also using DevOps. The team works on a sprint process where we're doing continuous integration, continuous deployment, all using Azure DevOps. So one other scenario I wanted to touch on was Azure deployments. So back to Matt's, one of his points about governance is, so we're focused on cloud governance. We're not focused on over-governance, but we want to make sure that we have developers that are tagging assets correctly. And so we want to ensure that we're using it from a billing perspective, but I also have this integration dashboard that is dependent upon some of this metadata. And so how can we enforce all of this data to be provided when creating a logic app? So here's just some snippets of my dashboard where we're pulling data from log analytics inside of Power BI. And if someone doesn't provide, say, the cost center or the project name or the data profile as part of their tags with their logic app, those are blanks in my dashboard. I don't like blanks in my dashboard. So what we've been able to do is to take reactive programming or event-driven architectures and use Event Grid, which you've heard about today, in order to enforce some governance. And so the idea is when a resource is created within an Azure subscription, Event Grid will fire, light up a logic app, and then we can use this logic app to log a ticket inside of ServiceNow. We could have also created a task inside of DevOps, but for now it's in ServiceNow. So let's go and take a quick look at this demo. Okay, so inside of our, and this is just in my own tenant for this demo, we've got events that light up inside of my Azure subscription. And as part of that, I can create a webhook, and that webhook is essentially going to be my Azure Logic app. So if I go ahead and create a new resource, and Sandra, what should I call this logic app? Sandro quit running, and he really needs to start running again. This will make more sense tomorrow. Okay, so I'm just going to put this in a resource group, and I'm going to go ahead and click on Create. So Event Grid's going to detect that this resource has actually been created, and then what it's going to do is light up this logic app. Now, while that is actually running, let's take a quick look at the logic app. So inside the logic app, we've got an Event Grid trigger, and as part of that trigger, we want to say what is the resource name that we want to listen for events on, and this is essentially my subscription. Now, I want to be looking for whenever there is a resource write success. So that means something's been provisioned, light this logic app up. Now, here's where I'm going to use a parse JSON action where the server or the Event Grid team has published a known schema of the data that you can expect. And so I'm going to now have a typed message inside of logic apps for that. I've got a couple variables, one for resource group, one for the logic app name. And in part, I need to do some parsing in these variables in order to support that. So for this demo, I'm just focusing on if the resource provider is Microsoft.logic, which represents logic apps. And when that occurs, I'm going to use an expression to parse the resource URI in order to extract the logic app name out of it and also the resource group out of it. Now I need both of those values because eventing isn't quite the same as messaging. Eventing is telling me that something has occurred. Now I need to actually go fetch the details behind that event. And that's what I'm going to do here using the read a resource action. And so here I provide my resource group, my logic app name, and then I can actually get more details about that specific resource. In this case, I'm just going to go ahead and check to see if there's any tags. And so I'm going to use tags in order to provide things like the cost center, the name of the project, etc. If they're blank, I'm then going to go ahead and create a record inside of ServiceNow. So if we head back to our Logic app, we'll see that it did run. And if we head over to ServiceNow and log in and hit refresh, we should find that we now have an incident or a ticket for our Logic app, Sandro quit running, published inside of ServiceNow. So obviously there's a lot of different use cases for event-driven integration. This was just one sample that we're using in order to enforce Azure governance. So a lot of information provided. You're probably asking, like, who is the winner? Which product is the winner? And the answer is the winner is the organization that figures out how to use both tools to create the right outcome for them. And one concept to really emphasize is that innovation doesn't happen while waiting in a line. And yesterday in the keynote, there was a comment from Gartner around that if you want to innovate, you need to integrate. And the whole thing is that you want to ensure that you're innovating and integrating outside of just one team. Alternatively, if you don't, what you'll find is that shadow IT will emerge. Because ultimately, shadow IT is a demand signal. It's a demand signal that the business isn't getting enough of what they want. So with that, I'll leave you with some resources. Naturally, I am part of Middleware Friday with Steph Jan. We do post most Fridays, vlogs, a lot of content on Azure integration services. So you'll find Logic Apps and APIM. There is some flow in there as well. Less since I've been on the product team, but there's still some there. Also, we've been contributing to serverless notes. So there's a lot of tips. We wrote a lot of tips around Logic Apps and Service Bus, Azure Functions as well. And then also, I've got this information summarized as a blog post. So you'll get some of this info here in this presentation. I naturally go into more details around the demos and the scenarios. But this will be posted at some point as part of the conference itself. Feel free to follow me on Twitter. And with that, thank you for joining me today.
Covey.co